My name is Ellen Field, and I'm an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education at Lakehead University. Previously to joining the faculty, I did my postdoc, which resulted in a national climate change education survey, which we benchmarked a lot of climate change education practice, as well as what parents, students, teachers, and members of the general public feel about the school's responsiveness to climate change. And before that, I'm a teacher, and I have also worked across Canada with about 800 teachers doing professional development on climate change education using inquiry project-based approaches and helping them understand the content knowledge, but also the pedagogical ways to engage young people in developmentally appropriate ways that also is mindful of the climate anxiety that they often have. So in the national survey that we conducted, there's points when you have tons of data and you're looking at it and get numb to these figures and these figures. But there was one data point in that national survey that just stuck with me. And I literally put my head down on my laptop when I saw it. Basically, we surveyed 500 young people from grades 7 to 12 in Canada, and we asked them a series of questions. And from those questions, we were able to also do an analysis of their ladder of engagement. From that, we could categorize them, whether they're dismissives of climate change, skeptics, whether they're in this aware category. And the aware category is really important because it basically means that they understand that climate change is happening, but they don't think there's anything that they can do about it. And then the last stage on the ladder of engagement is empowerment, which means that they think they understand climate change, but think there's things that they can do about it. And over 50% of students in grades 7 to 12 were in this aware category. So they understand it, but they don't think there's anything we can do about it. And when you think about what that means as a young person who is between 12 and 18 years old, who has their life ahead of them, and they see what's coming, but they don't feel that there's anything they can do to change it, then that's a serious gap. And that's what education needs to do, is to find ways for those young people to feel that they have solutions, be introduced to them, but also feel that they have some of the capacities to do solutions and be involved in them.
So
this isn't something that we can, as educators, just decide not to do. We have a duty of care, and we have to also be honest to young people about the reality of climate change. This is not like something we can just say, oh, I don't want to think about this, so it's not going to be real. This is real, and we have to be, as adults and as educators, we have to be honest with young people about the realities, and that can be difficult, but it's necessary, and help them build capacities to face it. So this is a critical question when you think about how the impacts of climate change will affect young people's lives. It is the existential issue of their time, and if they're not experiencing it in schools, in their curriculum, then that's going to lead to all kinds of dissonance and climate anxiety for them. And you see in the news and you see some of the stats on the levels of climate anxiety that young people experience. I come at this position that as educators and as people involved in education, we have a moral responsibility to be teaching climate change in order to prepare young people to be honest with them about what the realities are and to help them just conceptually grapple with that, as well as hopefully build capacities to find employment in some of the positive solutions that are on the horizon, if not already booming in green energies and clean tech. And I think that there seems to be a real gap in how that gets translated to young people, whether it's guidance counselors who have that information on the ready to say, these are jobs, these are places that you can go, or even programs. Like I know here in Canada, Humber College this year, so 2021 fall, is opening its Green Industries college program. But it's great that it's happening, but we should have been there 10 years ago. So there's so much opportunity and there's so much need. And so for me, as someone working in this space, I oscillate between the hope as well as the overwhelming sort of urgency, as well as the amount of work that needs to be done. So for policymakers who are just starting on this process, I think ensuring that every young person learns about the solutions that are available and ready could be a major shift in terms of even the mindset that some young people are going to have. So that would be like the starting point. And I think as well, the ways that climate change as well as COVID-19 has shown the injustices and inequities in the world, and that is now part of our public consciousness, that how we think about integrating that into our education approaches is, I think, the next iteration is how do we look at our education system more holistically? How do we see it more systemically to address these big issues? And inequity is one that has come out in the last 2 years, and it's not going to go away, especially as the climate crisis continues and as those inequities get exacerbated. So we need to ensure that young people, from a moral imperative, have some frameworks in order to think about how do we address inequity in a global system, although we only have national power. And that's where I think those conversations, like distributive justice, equity, all of those pieces where social justice can come into our education system are so important. And I really believe like schools are so important for our democracy and quality of life. They can help shift determinants of health. They can help be these interventionist spaces. And I don't see yet that sort of approach from policymakers in terms of seeing how schools can be these interventionist spaces on the climate portfolio in terms of how we can ensure we're attending to young people's well-being given the trajectories that we're on. So that's where I feel like there's so much opportunity for there to be educational leadership to see climate change and other issues systemically and to ensure that young people are getting an educational experience that will prepare them for the world that they're in. We know that we're going to be having altered climate futures, like what we have now, we'll be living with for the next 50 to 100 years. That's baked in. We can't just kind of go, we don't have to deal with it. That's not an option. I would love to see that. And I would love to see that coherent educational leadership coming through, because I see right now a lot of dissonance and a lot of people not naming it who are in educational leadership positions. So in terms of the question about how teachers can integrate this into science, math, civics, or art, climate change as a topic is transdisciplinary. And so none of us can be complete experts in it. Is the first thing I think teachers need to know, is that you could be an expert in food security, you could be an expert in ice cores, you could be an expert in carbon emissions, but you can't know all the answers. And so the climate crisis is really a learning issue, and we need to learn our way through it, because the knowledge that we have from our previous systems is not going to get us out of it. And so we need to be really comfortable in engaging in learning that is innovative, that is new, that we don't have all the answers. And so when students ask us questions, it's okay to say, I don't know, let's look into it. Because that's one of the biggest stumbling blocks for teachers often, is feeling not confident, that they don't understand it. And that's because it's an incredibly complex, transdisciplinary, emerging dynamic. And so the sooner we can recognize as teachers and educators that we need to learn our way through it, just like humanity and society needs to learn our ways through it, that it becomes this active laboratory that education can engage in. And that's where I think it gets really exciting in terms of ways that we can think about math. I've had students take the live data from the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii and start to look at probabilities and start to look at also data management from that. In terms of civics, this is incredibly interesting. I would love to be a civics teacher, because we are seeing our civic systems be challenged in ways that they haven't necessarily been challenged. And I would just like to highlight really the most ambitious climate policies we have in the world today. We have youth activists to thank for. So it's been youth plaintiffs who have gone and put in human rights cases about the intergenerational inequity because of how their lives will be affected. And that has resulted in some of the most ambitious climate policies. Germany, this last April, basically it was 8 youth who, through the Fridays for Future movement, put in a case against the new climate policy law that Germany had brought forward in 2019 and said that it will affect our quality of life. This is not meeting the 1.5 target to get us to 2030. And so the German government very quickly had to change their targets, and they have now committed to a 65% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030. And so I think part of this, in terms of civics, it's really interesting. I would love to have a debate in a class. What does it mean to be a citizen in today's world? And what does it mean to be an activist? And how do those overlap? Because I think we have a lot of preconceived notions around what activism is. However, when we know then there's systems that are not serving people and planet or protecting our well-being, then we need to change them. And so some of the ways that I know teachers can be really hesitant being active, we see young people doing this and we see them doing it outside of schools. And so I think that's an interesting place for civics to look at, is how can we foster this sense of active engagement in change making, and to also research what have been change making processes historically, what's worked. The other sort of piece is the youth climate justice movement as an entity globally is the largest social and environmental movement historically. So this is history being made. And so I just think as a civics teacher, how cool would it be to be teaching this stuff and really actively engaging young people, because they see it in their social media feeds and on the news. So we need to find ways for those stories to move off of social media and into our classrooms. The other last little tidbit of this is that I think is really interesting. So Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, the politician, he put the first motion to create a climate emergency forward in 2019 after all of the climate strikes. And in the motion he read on the House floor, he talks about the turning moment, the transformative moment for him was hearing young people outside of his office chanting. And then that led to the first climate emergency, which then has led to, I think it's 800 million people are now under climate emergency declarations that many municipalities and cities have taken. So I think that these spaces, ways that we can integrate and look at these sort of social change spaces, whether it's social studies or civics, is really interesting. And the last one, in terms of art, this is so incredibly important, because I think there's many ways that art is so important, but I think the one that I would preface is so much of the climate activism is coming out of a recognition of the need to change systems out of a survival response. And in those visions, they are often bereft of hope. They're in a survival scope. And art can be a place where we engage in imaginative visions for hopeful futures that aren't just coming from a narrative of dystopian future. And we know from science and from technology, we have the solutions. We can have a hopeful future. It's really about, can we create that public vision, and can we get the political will to move our systems towards it? And I think art is such a powerful place, and especially for young people, like the young activists I know, I don't feel their hope necessarily. I'm starting to. I feel the youth climate justice movement is starting to speak in hopeful language and rhetoric, but it really hasn't been. And so I feel that the ways that art teachers can help create those hopeful visions is so important for the kinds of, or ways of mitigating the kinds of climate anxiety that young people feel. And I think in part of that, and I'm not an arts-based expert, but I do recognize as well that young people need time to emotionally process and to normalize that it's completely normal to feel climate anxiety. It actually would be abnormal to not feel climate anxiety if you understand the urgency and what's at risk. And so I think that art can also be a space that allows for some of that emotional processing in other forms that aren't necessarily like direct conversation, or which is really important for young people to not just go from, I feel horrible because I see what my world's going to be, to then have a teacher say, well, we got to go to hope right away. We might need to get active right away. young people need to process those emotions a bit because they're normal, and it means that you're a compassionate human who has your eyes wide open. There's a Toronto-based graffiti artist named Bruno Smokey who does these wonderful big graffiti pieces that really look at those hopeful futures. And so how cool it would be to take a walking field trip with your class to go look at those and do a reflection piece. I also am just reading Kim Stanley Robinson's science fiction book, The Ministry of the Future, which is really looking at this positive view of what's possible through a science fiction book, but it's plausible based on the policy structures we have today. So I think the ways that we can play with that in creative spaces, and I'm sure others who have more expertise in this area can speak more clearly about it. So I think for teachers, there's so many ways to think about how we integrate climate change education, and it's really about having a conversation with the students in your class about what is worrying them the most. And I feel like sometimes we don't start there and ask them, what keeps you up at night about climate change? I call it the brainstorm of eco anxiety. And I've done it with teachers. We'll like cover a wall with our eco anxiety, and then we'll say, okay, how can we make this a lesson? What could we do with all of this? I feel like sometimes as teachers, we're too quick to decide what students need to learn about climate change, and we go right to the science and the urgency. And I think it would be helpful to get them to voice what their eco anxieties are, or their climate anxieties, and then to build a unit from that. I think more curriculum content would definitely help students make the connection in terms of this is a job area that I can be involved in. These are some of the growing industries which are doing so well. These are some of the businesses that have clear emission targets, as well as they align their business according to degrees of warming. And unless you follow the space closely in terms of the ways that the different economies, but also specifically businesses that are at the lead of this, it's hard to necessarily get that information. And I think having more in the curriculum is really helpful. And I do also think that it needs to be more than just content coverage. I think what I'm hoping for, and what a lot of students who are advocating for shifts in the education system, are deeper shifts than just adding more climate change content. So I think the starting point is to teach solutions. If we were just to put one sort of content piece into our curriculum, it would be to stop just teaching the knowledge and understanding of climate change, and to ensure that young people are also learning about the solutions that we have and that we just need to action. So these aren't technologies that we need to develop more or research more. These are on the ready. We just need to find the political will to employ them. There's an interesting movement right now. There's a group of 25 youth that came out of a leadership program. A few of them came out of a leadership program, and then they've branched out and developed a group called Climate Education Reform BC. And this group of young people are advocating for the Ministry of Education in BC they have a whole list of what they call needs, but they're really demands that need to be changed. And so they are advocating for the kind of change that they want to see especially their high school experience change too. And it really is in alignment with what we see in the youth climate justice movement. It's an intersectional view of climate change that relates to all kinds of topics, that deals with justice, not just intergenerational, but racial. And they put that forward, and they've met with the director there. And so far, they've gotten agreement for the curriculum to be reviewed by climate change experts. And now their next step is to have also input from climate activists, from diverse perspectives to review the curriculum. So it's not just climate change science as we typically have seen climate curriculums be reviewed by. So that's a kind of a cool example of young people who they've just graduated grade 12 this spring. We also know from the research, and I think it's important for teachers to know this, that in terms of what are strong predictors of students developing pro-climate behaviors, it's actually being immersed among other people who accept climate change And the second piece to that is developing leadership skills. And weaker predictors are understanding of the certainty of climate change. So it really comes down to a sense of having social norms and leadership skills. And so we do need to focus on the content knowledge. It is important, but not in the ways that science has often said, like that we teach knowledge, which will lead to attitudinal, which will lead to behavior change. We actually know that it's much more complicated, especially with climate change, because it's value systems, but it's especially with young people, it's around leadership and social norms. And so this is where maybe an extracurricular group, right, where your environment club with those who are already very motivated are going to be taking on a project would be a great way. And I think for teachers, I would think in your class, and there's a lot of different styles, especially internationally, in terms of the ways that teaching and student relationships occur. But if you're approaching teaching climate change in an inquiry way or in a dialogic way with your students, then you're not going to be feeding them information or coercing them. You're having a conversation and you're allowing them to have autonomy and agency over where they take that learning. And allowing them to learn things, show them what's out there is not something that teachers should feel like, oh, I can't talk about the Fridays for Future groups. Actually, Fridays for Future groups are really important spaces for young people to be able to organize, be involved in, take action. So that would be how I would also say that is connect your students to the local Friday for Future group. Sometimes we think about climate change as this monolithic thing, and it is global, but its impacts are local, as well as the solutions to climate change are dependent on the local context. And so it's really important for teachers to learn about how does climate change affect us locally and what are the ways that we can enact change on a local level, because both of those work simultaneously together. As soon as you start thinking about how do we change this monolithic global thing, that's where you get disenfranchised, you move into denial, it becomes too overwhelming. And so that helps mitigate climate anxiety is to start learning about who are the local organizations that are taking action on this, who in our municipal government can we ask to do things? Can we create a climate emergency declaration? What businesses can we maybe partner with? And this is where sometimes in schools we get focused on doing the same thing. And I feel like teachers sometimes will say, oh, we want to do a climate change project and we've been doing recycling. So we're just going to recycle better. And we need to really think about what are the impactful climate projects that we can do that aren't just environmental, but that are climate related and work with climate partners to leverage change. And so I think I'll tease this out because so often in environmental education, it's become sort of a private behavior change thing. Like, I'm just going to conserve water better. I'm going to do this on an individual level. And we can't individually get ourselves out of climate change. We could reduce our carbon emissions individually to a degree, but these are systems changes. And we can't meet the targets we need to get to by those individual changes. So that's where that's a very important capacity that young people need to learn is how to engage in collective change making, how to engage outside of our individual, our classroom, to our communities. And that's where climate action projects are so exciting when you start to have those kinds of things. So examples could be like, what about the local restaurant? Can you have a Meatless Monday campaign, right? Or can you, and you don't always hear teachers thinking in these ways. So I think we need also to tell the stories of some of the innovative climate change education projects that are occurring so that teachers can see what's possible because it's all new and we're all figuring it out. And so we need to find better ways to tell the things that are working really well and not just be committed to doing the things that we've always done environmentally because they're different. And that's where I think the work of Project Drawdown that really shows what are the specific solutions that we should action and prioritize. And as a teacher, that's a great starting point, and it's a global landscape. So then take Project Drawdown and figure out for your community what are the top 10 things that your community needs to do. Great climate action project. I think this opportunity in this moment in time where there is this sort of plasticity that we can see that the systems, the large systems and structures that govern our education system, our government, are being called into question because of the way that they don't safeguard people and planet. And that's an opportunity for education for sure, is to think holistically about how do we be responsive as educators to this moment in time. And from this moment in time, I think the the answers, the process approaches to how we address climate change come forward, and also around inequity. But it can only be figured out through an intersectional view of understanding the ways that inequity plays out through climate change, through COVID, and that we're responsive. And that's where I feel like schools are so, the possibility is there because they've always been these important benchmarks of democracy.